of Circulating.
All right, welcome everyone to today's seminar series. I'm happy to have Maxime and Jone here to talk about precipitation and the aurora. So our first speaker today will be Jone. Jone got his PhD from the University of Bergen in Norway, focusing on the investigation of asymmetries in Earth's aurora based on satellite global auroral imagery. Currently, he works as a researcher at Berkeley Center for Space Physics in Bergen. His main research focuses on advancing the understanding of how the magnetosphere influences the high latitude ionosphere. To achieve this, he combines information from a wide range of diverse datasets, primarily obtained from ionospheric observations. So today, Jone will be talking about the origins of KEV electron precipitation in the summer hemisphere polar cap. Jone, if you'd like to take it away.
Thank you for your nice introduction, Kyle. Can you guys see my slides now?
Yeah, your slides are up.
Thank you. So, as Kyle said, the title of my talk is Origins of KEV Electron Precipitation in the Summer Hemisphere Polar Cap. So we're going to focus on very high latitudes, actually almost all the way to the magnetic pole, and more specifically inside the Dayside polar cap in summer sunlit conditions. So I will start this presentation by introducing, giving some background on precipitation in this region, Dayside polar cap during local summer conditions. And more specifically, I will tune into a specific type of precipitation known as high latitude Dayside Aurora, and which I will refer to as HiLDA in this precipitation. Towards the end, I will also introduce a tool that we have used to investigate this further, a tool that we have called local mapping of polar ionospheric electrodynamics, which is a data assimilation technique developed in Bergen in my group led by Carl Løvendahl. And this is conceptually very similar to AMI, although the formalism or the formulation in the background is slightly different than AMI. We achieve the same thing to combine to express the ionospheric electrodynamics using the ionospheric Ohm's law. And if time permits, in the end, I will go on to say something about some broader implications of these precipitation features. Okay, so Aurora at the highest latitudes. So Aurora inside the polar cap has, I would say, proven to be notoriously difficult to understand. So if you look at the Aurora, different mechanisms may manifest itself in similar type of aurora. And you can also turn it the other way around, saying that the same type of source can also lead to a wide range of different auroral signatures. So it's often difficult to sort of untangle the different mechanisms from looking at the aurora alone, although looking at the aurora is an excellent remote sensing tool and able to map a very large region of the magnetosphere. So many subclasses and categories of auroral forms has been suggested and studied in great detail in the past decades. We can mention like poleward moving auroral forms on the Dayside, polar cap arcs and hooks, etc. What is often known as transpolar arcs. So arcs extending all the way from like the Dayside to the night side, also often known as theta aurora. And precipitation in the cusp region, so mapping it to the high latitude or Dayside reconnection site, both from northward IMF and southward IMF. This figure is taken from a review paper by Frey et al., summarizing the state of the art of our knowledge of these precipitation sources found from looking at the aurora. In general, one can say that the Dayside aurora and also the polar cap aurora, I would say, is found to show quite a direct correspondence to the upstream conditions, which is in contrast to the night side aurora, which is more activated by the tail dynamics. However, the acceleration mechanisms is still it's difficult to fully resolve and understand the acceleration mechanisms about how the electrons and ions get their energies to produce the aurora that we observe in the Dayside polar cap. So in this presentation, I will focus on what is known as the high latitude Dayside aurora. So this is one of the types of aurora we can get inside the Dayside polar cap. It was first attributed this name, HiLDA, high latitude Dayside aurora, by Frey et al. In a paper from 2003. And he saw these types of aurora quite often in the image FUV data. So image satellite, elliptic orbits, imaging the global aurora in UV. And an image is seen to the right here. And this was seen during sunlight conditions. So we have to subtract the day glow. And in UV, the day glow is not as substantial as it is in more visible wavelengths. So it's possible to see through the day glow in FUV. And in these images, it looks like a blob, like one can see here. Here it's at like 85 degrees latitude, very close to the pole in the post-noon region. And this type of precipitation has some similarities to cusp aurora. However, it's suggested to be a completely different process. I will not go into details about this discussion, but the cusp aurora, both for southward and northward IMF, is believed to map to the reconnection site. So either the opening of flux on the day side or the lobe reconnection site, where both electrons and ions get accelerated and produce aurora in the Dayside ionosphere. So in this sketch by Jenny Carter, and down to the left on this slide, we see this orange region. We see the two NBZ cells. When you have lobe reconnection, the lobe reconnection X line is expected to be this dashed gray line here on the Dayside. And the cusp precipitation typically maps to that region. When you have a BY, here is shown with a positive BY in the northern hemisphere, we get a circulation in the Dayside polar cap like this. This is like a clockwise circulation. And the HiLDA type of precipitation is seen typically inside this circulating lobe cell in the Dayside. Going into this HiLDA type of precipitation in more detail. Recently, it's been quite a few studies addressing this type of precipitation. And I think the reason for that is this the accumulated size of the DMSP SUSY database. Because you need to be space to see it because of the day glow. It's very, very difficult to see it from the ground. But in UV, you can see it from space, and as we see an example of from image FUV. But DMSP SUSY is much closer to the aurora and measures the similar UV wavelengths. And the bottom right image here shows such a SUSY scan. So SUSY provides a snapshot as it traverses the high latitudes and like 800 kilometers altitude. And we see now the aurora in great spatial detail. The temporal resolution is very poor, just one per orbit, but the spatial structure is great in these images. And we see these features quite often. And this has sparked quite a few studies on this topic recently. And this is from a paper by Lake High in 21. And we can see DMSP is coming in on the dusk side here in the northern hemisphere. It's entering the auroral oval, and we can see in the electrons, we see KV electrons from the plasma sheet. and as it crosses through the oval, it exits the oval and goes into the polar cap. We can see the ion precipitation just stops, and that is the MSP entering the polar cap. But inside the polar cap, we see this almost like a monoenergetic electron precipitation. And this is the HiLDA type of precipitation. This is very typical. It's almost like a monoenergetic. It can look like an inverted V type of feature. Here is like 1 to 10 keV, almost up to 10 keV precipitation. And the energy flux can also be quite significant in this very localized region. And it is found that this only happens, as I said, in the summer hemisphere, and only for one sign of By. So in the northern hemisphere, this occurs for positive IMF-By, while in the southern hemisphere, we get this when it's summer in south for negative By. This also typically happens when By is dominating and Bz is either small or northward. If the IMF is stable, which it can be, especially the By component is more stable than Bz, then this can last for many hours. So this is actually a quite common feature of the Dayside Aurora in the summer polar cap. This is just an example of how common it is. If you just average, this is just averaging many years of SUSY, LBHS passes together in the northern hemisphere during positive divolatile conditions and positive By, the clock angles between 45 and 90 degrees. You can also see it in statistics. It happens statistically in this region. So it's quite significant, the appearance of this feature. One of the recent papers on this topic has been by a Chinese group with the lead author Zhang et al. from 2021. And they coined the term space hurricane in association with this feature. So this was from an event, and it was a strong positive By summer in the northern hemisphere. And here we can see images from this event where you can see this the HiLDA precipitation close to the magnetic pole, and it also had structures, and they termed it the hurricane because there was some features of the precipitation. They called it like spiral arms. That we clearly saw some features of this precipitation. So this space hurricane is concept is significant because it's in one hemisphere only, so it represents a major imbalance and both in the precipitation and energy input into the two hemispheres, and also that these events which are so active in a Dayside polar cap, they are typically considered as quiet if you judge by like SUMH or AL index, because they are not capturing this dynamics at the highest latitude. This is fairly localized precipitation, and we also have Joule heating in the vicinity, but they often go under the radar of quiet events in the Auroral zone. Yes, as I said, this type of precipitation, it's only observed in UV from space due to sunlight. We cannot see it from the ground, at least not at present. And the global imagers, which is the top right is an example of, has a very good temporal resolution. You can get with polar UVI and image FUV, you can get to like 1 or 2 minutes spatial, no temporal resolution. However, the spatial resolution is quite poor for these features. As we can see from the SUSY imager on the MSP, which is a LEO satellite, the spatial structures are into the tens of kilometers, at least, which is not possible to resolve with these older global imagers. So it's actually the dynamics of these features is actually unknown. It's never been possible to look in great both temporal and spatial detail of these precipitation. So that's still an unknown Maybe polar UVI is actually the best instrument to study that. And at present, I'm actually not aware of any polar UVI studies of this type of precipitation. I'm sure there exists quite a few such events, but that had slightly sometimes higher resolution than the image had. Okay, so going more into details of this HiLDA precipitation. So as I said, cusp type of precipitation refers to particles coming from the reconnection sites and accelerated towards the Earth. And this typically consists of both electrons and ions. However, what we're looking at here is exclusively electron precipitation. As we saw in this CMSP example a few slides ago, we only had electron precipitation. There was basically no ions hitting the detector. And that's a very prominent feature, which also was found in the image wiki or image FUV era shown by Harold Fry, that it's electron precipitation. And we also know that there is a strong vortical plasma flow around this precipitation. And what I will try to follow up next now is a discussion about the formation mechanism. Can we say something more about the physics leading to this type of precipitation? So I will again point to this recent paper by Kai et al. in 2021. Here is one of the events he studied with DMSP. So we can see it's a long-lasting event. Each frame here, A, B, C, D, and so on, is each orbit of DMSP. So we can see that the temporal, although like 90 minutes apart, evolution of this structured precipitation. And he did a very thorough assessment of these events. And he summarized, I can't remember how many events he looked at, but he said that from looking at both the particle data, the magnetometer data, and also the imaging, the SUSI imagers on DMSP, he has pointed out that the precipitation feature seems to be confined inside a broader region of upward field line current. Because what has been shown earlier by for instance, Harold Fry and others, is that the HiLDA precipitation are associated with this upward field line current. That's not. But what Kai is showing here is that the precipitation, yes, it occurs inside the upward field line current, but he's claiming that it's only a tiny fraction of this region. There's not like a one-to-one correlation between the HiLDA precipitation and upward field line current. It's a small region within the upward field line current region. That was one of the findings from Kai's paper. And he also claimed that the HiLDA precipitation is likely to map into the lobes. That's also an important point. And as I said, HiLDA precipitation is likely to only be a small part of the larger upward field line current region. And he pointed out that the Dayside polar cap map into regimes of vastly different plasma properties. So from the lobe reconnection site, which is this pink dashed line here on the Dayside, that would like map into the reconnection site, into the magnetosheet, and then you can follow these field lines into the mantle, and then eventually into the lobes. And the plasma properties from the magnetosheet to the mantle to the lobes, they are vastly different. Considering, for instance, that the plasma density is much higher in the magnetosheet than in the mantle, and the mantle plasma density is typically higher than the lobe plasma density. The lobes has the lowest plasma density. So what are the implications of this scenario? So lobe reconnection is believed to be the ultimate source. That was also what has been known earlier. But the acceleration mechanism of the HiLDA precipitation is not directly associated with the kinetic processes at the reconnection site, like it is for the cusp aurora. So the structure and dynamics of HiLDA precipitation may reflect the plasma regimes mapping into the lobes, like the plasma density. So I will come back to this after showing my next slide, which is our own analysis of a HiLDA event with our data assimilation structure. So we were motivated by the findings by Lake High, which basically had this cartoon saying that the HiLDA typically took place inside the upward field line current region, but it only populated a small region. So we thought that this data assimilation technique that we have developed in Bergen would be very well suited to test this. So we took this event published by Zhang et al., which they call the space hurricane event. So it was a strong HiLDA type event. And we applied our data assimilation. So the data assimilation is basically similar to AMI, as I said. So we're using the ionospheric Ohm's law to relate the electric field and the current through conductance. So we have to specify a conductance pattern, and that we do based on sunlight, which is important in the summer event, but also the auroral precipitation, which we get from SUSY. So we use their derived characteristic energy and energy fluxes. We apply the Robertson equations to get an estimate of the auroral conductances. So that's the link between the electric field and the currents in Ohm's law. So through this Ohm's law relationship, we can combine measurements of convection. So we use convection measurements from SuperDARN, which is all these scattered arrows in the top left panel. So all these panels are oriented in the noon midnight direction. Noon is on top, midnight is on bottom, dusk towards the left. So all the orange arrows is is the data that goes into the data assimilation, the Lompe framework. So we see the scattered orange arrows in the top left is SuperDARN, and this strip of orange arrows, that's the drift from DMSP. And the blue contours, that's the fitted electric potential from our data assimilation, which is in this case actually quite well defined because of all the data that goes into this. In the second panel on the top, we see orange arrows again is the input, and that is the delta B measurements from ampere. So that gives a handle on helps us predict the field line currents, and the red and blue color contours in this panel, that's the output of the data assimilation, being the up and down field line currents. And here we can actually see something very similar to what Lake High was concluding in this paper. So the red is the upward field line current, and the green contour is the contour of the precipitation we see in SUSY. So indeed, there is a strong field line current upward where we have the precipitation, but there's no one-to-one correlation between the upward field line current and the precipitation. So there's a lot of upward field line current when there is no precipitation, but it takes place inside, like Lake High was predicting or suggesting just from looking at the DMSP data. So this data assimilation analysis is very much supporting his interpretation of his different events. Yes. With this data assimilation, we can also look at quantities like Joule heating, so electromagnetic energy input, and we see that actually takes place on a Dayside, and not where we have the precipitation, but where we have a strong current and a strong E field. So we do E dot J to get the Joule heating, and that it's actually quite significant, mostly taking place poleward of 80 degrees in this case. So I'm getting towards the end. So what are the implications for the formation mechanism of high latitude Dayside Aurora? So we have arrived at a hypothesis which is sort of building upon this paper by Lake High that I've been talking about. So we suggest that, or we say that one hypothesis it's possible that the HiLDA precipitation we see may reflect the plasma density in the lobes. Okay, so consider the following case. We have lobe reconnection, and if we have a steady IMF, we will get this steady lobe cell, which we very frequently observe in the Dayside polar cap. So one is the lobe reconnection site in the Dayside polar cap, and we get this east-westward forcing due to the tension force on the open field lines, and we get this stirring of the field lines, adding them into the lobes. But this is not exactly where the HiLDA precipitation takes place. So what may happen is that the field lines inside the lobes may not mix with the plasma taking place in the lobe circulation process. So if for some reason the plasma inside the lobes sort of get trapped, but they are forced to circulate because of the global surroundings, because of the lobe reconnection is taking place, we may end up with a situation where the lobe field line tends to wind up because of this circulation. And to carry that current, this corresponds to an upward field line current. But if the density is not, if there is no mixing of the plasma, there is no, the density may be very low in the lobes, which is typically the case. And therefore the electrons need to be accelerated to carry the current that this winding that is forced by the lobe circulation prescribes. So the bottom right here is sort of just a sketch of how this is. We intend that this may look like in the cross section of the tail. So this is back in the mid tail is the YZ cut. So the lobe reconnection process takes flux from the lobe reconnection sites, adds it back into the lobe, and we get the lobe circulation. And if there is some field lines inside the lobe that does not mix because of that, that may be the region mapping to the HiLDA precipitation. So this is basically a hypothesis. It's not been tested with data, but if this is the case, then the HiLDA precipitation may reflect the plasma density structure in the lobes. So in order to validate this, we would need either in situ spacecraft data from the lobes, like cluster, for instance, or high temporal and spatial resolution of auroral observations beyond what exists today to give any new insights. Yes. My last slide will be just saying something very short about some broader implications of these types of events. And the bottom line is that they are very common. The histogram shown here in panel A is just a histogram of the dipole tilt angle distribution, saying that 2/3 of the time we have a clear season in either summer or winter in the two hemispheres. And the panel B histogram is the polar histogram of the IMF clock angle, saying that 2/3 of the time we have a BY dominated IMF. So the combination of dipole tilt and IMF BY is quite common. And when these two factors act together, it produces very pronounced asymmetries between the two hemispheres. So both not only the precipitation will be different in the two hemispheres, but also Joule heating locally in the polar cap will be vastly different. Yes, I think I will stop here.
All right, thank you, Jone, for a wonderful talk. We do have a couple comments and questions in the chat if you want to have a look,
Yes.
but we are going to go quickly into Maxime's just so that we stay on time.
Yes, sure.
So Maxime, if you would like to take the screen, we can start with the next talk.
Yes, I'm going to share my screen. All right, can you see the slides?
Yep, thank you.
Excellent.
So I'll do a quick intro and then you can go. So Maxime is a postdoctoral research at the University of Helsinki in Finland. He obtained his PhD in 2017 from Sodanka Geophysical University and the University of Oulu. His current work focuses on ionosphere and magnetosphere coupling through particle precipitation, especially using global hybrid simulations and the Vlasiator model. He's interested in citizen science applied to ionospheric studies, and in particular, investigating the dune aurora using night sky photographs taken by citizen sciences combined with geophysical instruments and observations. So with that, Maxime, if you'd like to take it away.
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. It's very exciting. So my talk today is going to focus more on my Vlasiator studies, especially related to the study of auroral particle precipitation using global simulations from this hybrid blast of code. So well, you probably all know that, but to give a bit of motivation, why we do that with Vlasiator, as you know, particle precipitation is a crucial process when it comes to magnetosphere-ionosphere coupling. It leads to an input of energy into the upper atmosphere, which is difficult to quantify on global scales. We have very good satellite observations of particle fluxes. We have ground-based observations from which we can retrieve the precipitating spectra, for instance, with the incoherent scatter radar. But the problem is that those observations, generally, they will give you only local observations. And sometimes to get the big picture, one way to do it is to use global models, which can enable looking at precipitation over larger scales. Most global models are using the magnetohydrodynamics description. And as such, it means that to quantify the particle precipitation, they need to use empirical formulae. And that's why Vlasiator can be actually interesting to look into an alternative approach, because we are using here a kinetic or hybrid kinetic model in which it's possible to, using the kinetic description of the particles to quantify in a more self-consistent way the particle fluxes and quantify the associated energy input into the upper atmosphere. So first of all, I will explain a little bit what Vlasiator is for those who might not be familiar. So just to give a bit of background, Vlasiator is a model which is being developed at the University of Helsinki in Finland. The PI is Professor Minna Pamrot. And currently in our team, we have about 20 members, many postdocs, a few university researchers, and a few PhD students as well. So the Vlasiator journey started around 2009. It received funding from the Academy of Finland as well as European Research Council grants. And in short, what Vlasiator is, it's a global hybrid Vlasov model of near space plasma. So I'll get to the detail in the next slide. But until recently, we were having essentially so-called 2D 3D runs or 5D runs. So 2D for like 2 dimensions in ordinary space and 3D for 3 dimensions in velocity space. In 2D runs, we had a typical spatial resolution of 300 kilometers. And the velocity space had a resolution of 30 kilometers per second. And just with those specifications, just to give you an idea, if we want to run Vlasiator using those resolutions for, say, about maybe half an hour, a little bit more, we need 5 to 10 million CPU hours. So it's like really, it requires supercomputers. And the output files that are produced represent something like a few tens of terabytes of memory space. So running Vlasiator is definitely not cheap. And as you will see a little bit later, we start having now 3D runs or 6D runs. But I'll get to that in a minute. I'll first start a little bit talking about our 2D results. The equations behind Vlasiator. So as I said, it's a hybrid Vlasov code. So it's treating ions and electrons in a different way. So typically, in most cases, our ions are only protons. We do have a couple of runs with helium ions also. But let's assume that we talk about protons when I say ions. The ions are treated as a 3D velocity distribution function, which is propagated in time using the Vlasov equation, which I show here. And the electrons, on the other hand, since it's only a hybrid code, they are not really considered. They are treated as a cold, massless, and charge neutralizing fluid. Now, when it comes to the electromagnetic fields, they follow Maxwell's equations under a few hypotheses, such as the Darwin approximation. And to close the system, we have Ohm's law, in which we include the whole term as well as a description of the electron pressure gradient term, and it's given here. If you want details about Vlasiator itself, I invite you to have a look at the Palmroth et al. 2018 paper, which is a sort of a review paper on Vlasov methods, focusing mostly on explaining how Vlasiator works. Hide this. So yeah, just so that you can visualize a little bit how it works in practice, we have the ordinary space domain here. So this is a 2D run. The Earth would be at the center here. The sun would be on the right and the north would be on top. And if we just zoom in on the tail region, you see that we have like many cells in ordinary space. And if we take a single cell here and we zoom in and have a look, we have in each of those cells a velocity space grid, which is a Cartesian grid as well, in which the phase space density is discretized to produce those velocity distributions. Now, that's many QR codes, apologies. Just before I delve into what we are doing with particle precipitation with Vlasiator, I just want to give an overview of possible other topics that have been investigated and led to publications, in case some of you are interested, maybe not so much in the precipitation, but in other aspects of magnetospheric physics. So just very briefly, in the first column, I listed a few papers which deal with force shock and bow shock physics. For instance, the first one looks at bow shock non-locality. Then we have a paper about force shock cavitons, another one about quasi-parallel bow shock reformation, and finally another one about the transmission of force shock waves beyond the bow shock. Then getting a bit closer to the Earth in the magnetosheath, we have a paper first which looks into the asymmetries between the quasi-parallel and quasi-perpendicular regions of the magnetosheath. I mean, in the downstream of the bow shock, I mean. The second paper looks at what kinds of ion scale instabilities can grow in Vlasiator simulations as a function of the chosen ordinary space resolution. The third one talks about magnetosheath jets, and the fourth one is looking into soft X-ray emissions in near-Earth space, especially coming from the magnetosheath. And this is a study that I have been leading in collaboration with the SMILE satellite modeling working group. Then getting a little bit closer to the Earth again and focusing on the Dayside magnetopause and the cusps, we have first a paper looking at flux transfer events forming at Dayside magnetopause, how they evolve, how they form, and what their properties are. Then this and then comes a paper which is a little bit exotic in the sense that it's neither fully 2D nor fully 3D. It's what we call 2.9D run, in which essentially we take a 2D slice of ordinary space, but we give it a certain thickness of several cells. And that Falkamp et al. Paper looked at Dayside reconnection, how it evolves in that third dimension, even though it's relatively thin. And finally, we have a paper by Alavarti et al., which looks into energy transfer across. And as the last category, I have a few papers on the night side. First, magnetotail current sheet flapping paper, then some night side precipitation that I'm going to show very briefly as well. Runoff et al. Gives a review of ion velocity distributions in the tail near the reconnection line. And finally, we have, this is then a 3D paper about precipitation that I'm going to show a little bit more in detail. But yeah, that was for some sort of relatively broad and hopefully short enough introduction about Vlasiator. And now let's look a little bit into particle precipitation as we can derive it. And of course, because we are in the hybrid Vlasov formalism, we can look at the protons in terms of precipitation. So how do we do that in practice? So I'm starting with the 2D runs. So we use in those past studies, we use two different runs, one with a purely southward IMF and the other one with purely northward IMF. All the other parameters are the same, relatively fast solar wind driving speed and very tenuous solar wind. So the way we do it is that in those cells where the full velocity distribution was saved in the output files. That's not done everywhere because it would cost way too much memory space, but we do save it every few cells. So in those cells, we can actually look at what there is in the velocity space. And there are two examples shown here. So we have this velocity grid, and we can look at the loss cone, the bounce loss cone in velocity space. And looking at the phase space density contained in this bounce loss cone, it is relatively straightforward to derive the differential number flux of precipitating protons. So we can do that as at those few virtual spacecraft locations. And once we have the differential flux, it's very easy to simply integrate it in order to get the integrated energy flux. And what you see here, for instance, is that those two virtual satellites as a function of time in the simulation. So we are talking in seconds. Here you see it's a bit over half an hour for this run. And the energy is given as the vertical axis. You can see how the precipitation from the night side evolved, how it suddenly got enhanced and then took a different shape and so on. I'm not going to give many more details on this. You can have a look at the paper if you're interested in the results. Just in a nutshell, with the 2D runs, what kind of results did we get? So first of all, I'm going to focus on what happens on the day side and starting with the northward IMF. So here you have an animation which will start now, in which the sun is again on the right-hand side. You recognize the Earth. And we have purely northward IMF. So in this ideal setup, we have dual lobe reconnection at high latitude. It's just the reconnection sites are actually just outside of this of the box. But you see that when you have a lobe reconnection, typically you will observe a spot-like precipitation in the cusp at high latitude. But what we saw in this run is that there is another type of precipitation that is, in theory, possible when some protons travel along the field line direction all the way. If they start, for instance, from the northern hemisphere, they will travel along the Dayside magnetopause, and they will end up on closed field line, newly closed field line from the southern lobe reconnection, and they will end up in the southern hemisphere low latitude boundary layer. So we have been looking into that. So it's difficult to get observations validating this because we are in such an idealized setup that this might be purely theoretical. Still on the day side, but looking at the southward IMF, maybe the key result of the study in 2D was that we saw a coincidence of proton precipitation bursts into the cusp with the transit of flux transfer events at the same time. And just in a nutshell, what we had in the night side precipitation study, so that was only with the southward IMF run, we found that when you have reconnection in the tail, this launches some protons towards the Earth, but instead of having them go directly into the plasma sheet and reaching the high latitude in the ionosphere, sometimes the transition region between the dipole-like field lines and the stretched field lines seem to act like some sort of a buffer which lets some bursts, proton bursts, go through and retain some others for some time until maybe there is enough energy stored in order to release the next burst. So this is something that probably needs a further investigation. But if you're interested in the details of how we got those results, you can have a look at the 2019 paper. But let's move on to something a bit more exciting, because now we have 3D runs. And I want to show you the freshest results we had. So this is just a quick introduction of our first production 6D run, so 3D ordinary space and 3D in velocity space. So you have here an overview. The sun would be then along the x direction, so towards the left for a change. We use driving conditions which are uniform and constant as usual. Southward IMF, purely southward, 5 nanotesla, fast solar wind speed, tenuous solar wind. So these are exactly the same input parameters for the solar wind as the 2D southward IMF run. Just a quick word on the boundary conditions. Our inner boundary is located at 4.7 Earth radii, and it's behaving like a perfectly conducting sphere. The size of our simulation domain extends from 50 Earth radii on the Dayside in the sun direction to 110 Earth radii in the tail, so that we really have a large portion of the tail. And then along the Z and the Y directions, we are between plus minus 58 Earth radii. Now, one thing you might notice if your screen resolution is good enough is that the ordinary space resolution is not the same everywhere. Like, as you can see, if we are further away from the Earth, and especially in the pristine solar wind, we have coarser resolution than when we get closer, especially at the Dayside magnetopause or in the tail current sheet. This is because we use adaptive mesh refinement. That's the way those 6D run became possible. If you're interested in the technical details, there is recently the Ganser et al. 2023 paper, which got published, where all the technology and infrastructure enabling those 6D runs is explained in details. And this run has been performed for a bit over 1,500 seconds. You note that the spatial resolution, by the way, is much coarser, even at the finest level. It's much coarser than in 2D, but this is as good as we can get at the moment with the current computational capabilities. One really big thing that happened when we moved to the 3D runs was that while the coders of Vlasiator were preparing the code for enabling the 6D, I had time to implement the differential flux calculation from velocity space into the Vlasiator code itself directly, meaning that I created a data reduction operator writing into the output file from every single cell the differential fluxes of precipitating protons. This is great because then instead of having only a few virtual spacecraft available from the output files, we now are able to look at proton precipitation everywhere in the simulation domain. And in practice, for this run, it was implemented in 9 energy bins, which are logarithmically spaced from 0.5 keV to 50 keV. And what we do, because very often we look at precipitation well from an ionospheric perspective. So what is done is that we look at those precipitating fluxes close enough to the inner boundary, and we map them along the magnetic field all the way onto an ionospheric grid as a function of geomagnetic latitude and magnetic local time. And so here is the kind of things you get. So you have the northern hemisphere on the left and the southern hemisphere on the right. And focusing mostly on the top panels, integral energy flux, you have polar views. So the pole would be in the center, noon on top, midnight in the bottom. And if you see first the cusp precipitation, you see that as a function of time, it becomes dimmer or brighter, which says that it comes in the form of bursts. And looking at the night side, we have it's evolving relatively slowly, but we do have some changes also. And those changes can be compared to what happens in the tail. That's the bottom panel. We have the plasma flow here. Whatever is red goes towards the Earth. Whatever is blue goes away from the Earth. So in the white part is some sort of proxy for where the reconnection line would be. And we can actually see, for instance, that the fast earthward flow around the 1000 seconds in the simulation led to the appearance of midnight sector precipitation. Among the visualization that we can do from this run, there are many possibilities, and I'm just going to show two examples. First of all, we can have a look at local proton spectra. So these are on the night side or on the day side. They are taken roughly at those orange dots, so arranged as a function of magnetic local time and geomagnetic latitude. And each panel tells as a function of time in the simulation what kind of energies you encounter. So for instance, in the night side, you see that in the pre-midnight sector, you have at some point in the beginning of the simulation, once the initialization was more or less over, you have 3 successive bursts of precipitation, which are not seen in the midnight or post-midnight sectors. And then the fast earthward flow that I was mentioning close to the x-axis translated into a burst of precipitation starting around 1100 seconds. Now on the day side, those spectra, they look quite different. We see very clearly some successive bursts with clear time energy dispersion simply due to time of flight effects. And what is interesting is that we could compare the occurrence of those precipitation bursts with the transit of flux transfer events in the corresponding cusp. Now, another way to look at the data is to take complete slices as a function of magnetic latitude and look at the precipitation along this slice as a function of time. So again, it's done separately for the night side and the day side. And I'm showing here 2 energies. The background color is 1.6 keV, and the ISO contours is 8.9 keV. And we see, for instance, on the night side that the higher energies seem to be slightly poleward from the lower energies. And again, there is this clear midnight precipitation starting with the fast earthward flow. On the day side, we again see successive bursts. And we see, for instance, comparing the northern and southern hemispheres, that there is no one-to-one correlation, simply because a given flux transfer event which forms with Dayside magnetopause reconnection, it can then migrate either towards the northern or the southern cusp, but it doesn't have to be a strictly symmetrical process. And looking at the maximum magnetic latitude of maximum fluxes, we see that it doesn't evolve much throughout the run, but this is expected because our driving conditions are steady. It's very nice to look at all the processes that we can see in our simulation, but it could be even nicer if we can check whether they are realistic and how they compare with observations. So we've been searching for events with similar solar wind driving conditions. It's not very easy to find because we have a bit somewhat exotic driving conditions just due to technological constraints. But we found 2 events during which the solar wind looked pretty much like in this Vlasiator run. And we compare then our results with DMSP observations. And we have, for instance, 2 DMSP overpasses per event, one going across the cusp and one going across the night-side auroral oval. And we compare, for instance, the integrated energy fluxes along the satellite track. We find that in the cusp, for instance, the peak seems to be a bit like about 1 degree off in magnetic latitude. And the maximum values are, there is a factor of maybe 2 to 3 between the two, which, given that the precipitating fluxes can vary over several orders of magnitude, is relatively satisfactory. And we can also do the same looking at the details of the differential number fluxes. On the night side, the comparison is also relatively okay. There are slightly larger differences between the two. Vlasiator underestimates a little bit more systematically what DMSP sees, but this is not very surprising given that we don't have anything within our beyond our inner boundary, and our inner boundary does not really behave like an ionosphere would. So that means that we can expect that the ionospheric feedback, which might play quite a crucial role in regulating the night side precipitation, is a bit missing from Vlasiator. Okay, in the last minute, I will just address a question that you might have, like how about electrons? If we talk about auroral precipitation, electrons are actually important as well. Well, Vlasiator being hybrid Vlasov, we cannot directly look into electrons, but we have recently started developing an offshoot of Vlasiator in which the electrons are treated like a Vlasov population. It's called eVlasiator, very appropriately. And what we do in practice is we take a Vlasiator run for protons. We take a specific time step. We generally choose a smaller subset of the simulation domain to facilitate the computation. And inside this subset of the domain, we initialize a Vlasov electron population. We assume that the proton parameters and the fields are static during the run, and we just make the velocity distribution functions of electron follow the Vlasov equation. If you're interested in the method, there is the Butterby et al. Paper, which explains the details. And if you want to see some results when compared with NMS observations, there is Alho et al. 2022. But for what I am concerned, I want to look at precipitating electron fluxes, even though that gives me only a snapshot. I'm not going to show more than this slide on this because this is still very preliminary analysis. But overall, we can plot in a similar fashion as for protons the global view of auroral electrons. You identify the cusp here on the night side oval. We can also look at the individual spectra. That's, for instance, shown in the midnight sector. You see that we have a relatively flat distribution below 1 keV, and then decrease up to our cutoff energies are generally up, on the order of 20 keV. But you will tell me then, yes, this is great, but Vlasiator does not have anything inside the inner magnetosphere. And of course, electron precipitation is such that chorus waves are really important to scatter electrons into the loss cone. And this is something that happens in the inner magnetosphere. Potential drops above auroral arcs are also completely missing. So what can we actually do? Well, we can look at what contribution to auroral electron precipitation comes from the reconnection or like the global dynamics in the tail, for instance. That's our objective given what we have. And yes, well, I guess, yeah, do I even need to read that? Well, the summary is that we look at, we use Vlasiator and its hybrid Vlasov description to self-consistently calculate the precipitating proton differential fluxes from the VDFs. And we have like a couple recent publications in 2D and especially in 3D. And regarding the electrons, we might be doing something, but it's still very preliminary. So yeah, I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Maxime, for a wonderful talk. We do have one quick question that we can take before leaving, and it's from Eric Lund. And I have a similar question. I'm glad he's asked it. Do you have a systematic way of determining which Vlasiator time steps to choose from for eVlasiator runs? You guys generate so much data that it must be quite difficult to work through everything.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, so far we don't have so many. We have just one eVlasiator run in 3D. We have a few in 2D. The way we chose the time step was essentially a time step in the proton run where things look interesting and we want to know how it looks for electrons. If we get enough resources for that and human power also, we can then maybe generate more eVlasiator snapshots, and then maybe we will need to look a bit carefully into what time steps we want to look at. But generally, we just take a time step where things are happening in the tail.
Okay, cool. So thank you again, and thank you, Jone, for 2 wonderful talks. I hope everyone has a wonderful week, and I hope to see everyone next Monday as well. Take care.